All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Sorry we're a couple minutes late. So tonight is the St. Cloud City Council Joint Workshop, and we'll start with a roll call.
Mayor Blackwell, Deputy Mayor Matheny,
Here.
Councilmember Urban,
Here.
Councilmember Askew,
Here.
Councilmember Trace.
Here.
Great, thank you. So item number 3 tonight is the annual report by the Historic Preservation Board.
I have my notes here on my phone, so forgive me. I forgot my glasses. So I just wanted to thank the council for meeting HPB today, and it's going to be really nice to have an annual meeting. I think that we should do an annual meeting in the month of May going forward. So May 2023, May is National Historic Preservation Month, as you all learned last month when I
nice.
talked to you. So I'll get a little bit into that, but I also wanted to recognize member Tony Jones, because she is the one who so passionately requested to meet with you all. So I'm sure that she'll have a couple of things to say, but I think that this is a good opportunity for the board to actually have a dialogue with City Council and let them know what they're working on and what their goals and objectives are. So with that, I will start. So we did have a joint meeting in June, and I provided you with an overview of what was happening in regards to HPB. So for 2022, the HPB has prioritized a number of projects. First is education and marketing. They want to help citizens to better understand the concept of historic districts, the associated ordinances, and the COA process. We do have trifold brochures that I shared with you all at the last meeting. We've gotten the first printing of that done. We're going to circulate that out in the community. That way, if we need to make any tweaks or revisions to it, we'll do so before the second printing, which would be a larger print of that. And that will be distributed at City Hall, of course, at the Heritage Museum, at St. Cloud Main Street office, and wherever else the board members and you all may think that we should distribute it. The next thing that's on goal for 2022 is the objective of getting design guidelines created for the historic district. That is something that is lacking right now. What you all have is a basic kind of starter ordinance, is what I refer to it, which is exactly where you want to be when you have a relatively new historic preservation board. But the board has been around enough years now that you really should be looking at the next level. So kind of, getting that ordinance a little bit clearer. And one of those important things is the design guidelines. And I have been working with you all since October. I am seeing applications for new construction in the district, as well as applications for demolition. So having design guidelines in place is very important. The next thing we are working on is tax incentives. So there is a reference to tax incentives in the current ordinance, but it's actually not being implemented. So we're taking a look at that to explore what kind of tax incentives can be offered for historic preservation projects. And then the last thing we're working on, and we hope to have this active for next May, is going to be an awards and plaque program. So this would be for recognition of significant rehabs that really shine and reflect what we're trying to achieve with historic preservation here. I did want to update you a little bit, and I have an ask of you all. So we actually submitted an application for a small matching grant. St. Cloud is a certified local government, so it's eligible for grant funding without a required match. So we submitted an application for $50,000. St. Cloud Main Street also submitted a separate application for a separate scope of work, which means if both of these get funded, that represents approximately $100,000 worth of historic preservation projects in St. Cloud. The ask that I have from you all is just that I will be submitting a draft letter of support that I'd like the council to sign, as well as a letter of support for the city manager to sign, so we can submit that to the grant application. And one thing that I just did want to state on the record is Wendy Colazzo, the finance director, has been really hand-holding me and helping me to understand the city's internal processes and procedures when it comes to just, expenditure of funds, but also, the grant application. So I just wanted to just state that because she has been just unbelievably helpful. National Register of Historic Places. This is also something that I talked to you about last month, and this is really exciting because presently there is a draft application that has been prepared for the city of St. Cloud's downtown to be listed on the National Register. This is in process through a state grant that was actually awarded to Main Street. And just last week, we had a public meeting, and we had the State Historic Preservation Office representatives come in and do a presentation to the board. So they were here for most of the day. We got to tour them around, and then they came and did a board training. We were planning to go to the August National Register Review Board meeting. The state actually wants us to shift that to November. The reason why is we're still really trying to get this connection of kit houses in St. Cloud. We know that St. Cloud has some kit houses. That's very important. We have rumors of kit houses in St. Cloud. I have kit houses referenced in the draft nomination, but we really need to substantiate those. So we need some actual physical evidence or records that these are actual kit houses, Aladdin kit homes. So that's another request we have out to the public for anybody with information that actually not just, saying we think this is a kit house, but actually conclusive evidence. Otherwise, we're actually going to have to remove that from the nomination. So the state is giving us a little bit more time to work on that and also to get some inconsistencies with dates resolved in that draft nomination because the research has all been relying on newspaper accounts, which aren't always correct. So I'm working with a local historian who's also been very helpful. So having said that, we'll go to the National Register Review Board meeting in November, and it looks like if all goes well with that, by January of 2023, you all will have a National Register Historic District, which will be something to be very proud of. And this is something that I wanted to talk about a little bit more. I made mention of the annual report, how I'd like to see us do this in May, but I did want to state, and I have this on the slide, for you to see, that the information about an annual report, this is actually in the Historic Preservation's ordinance for the city of St. Cloud, that the board is supposed to be giving an annual report. And one of the things that we're supposed to be giving an annual report on is to update on the tax exemption that's proposed in the ordinance that we actually don't have active. So this is something that we've got to resolve. It would be great to have the annual report done during May. We would still stick with this guideline of updating the city council in January of all these numbers and everything. We would work between January and May to actually craft this into a format where we can have a nice marketed PDF that it's not just information for the city council, but information that you all can share with your citizens. So the citizens can actually see the activities of the Historic Preservation Board and it not just be the tax exemption, but what might be, the award-winning properties in town. What is the information about how many building permits have been pulled? What is the value of the building permits in the historic district? What kind of new construction projects have you had done and all of that? And so that's what I hope to achieve, is that we can actually have that as a standing meeting in May where we would talk about those different things. And we would have, like we did last month, we'd have the proclamation and do the city council and joint HPB meeting where you all can have a discussion with each other. And again, the preservation awards and recognition. One thing that I wanted to also state about the preservation awards and recognition is these programs always work well if they're done outside a city council environment in a social setting where you might have an actual reception with food and drink and, recognize the award winners there. So I don't know if that's something that the city would be amenable to come May, actually planning a historic preservation event to recognize the award winners, but it's definitely something that I suggest. And doing also for the month of May, a historic preservation presentation to the community, just updating the community on what's happened in the past year in preservation. that's all I had for my presentation. I know that one of the objectives was for the board members to actually have a conversation with city council, so I'm gonna go ahead and let them do that. And I will start with Member Jones, since she is the one who requested the meeting, so there you go.
Thank you, Ms. Dalton. Good evening, afternoon. My name is Tony Jones, and I'm a member of the Historic Preservation Board and have been since its inception. I love St. Cloud, and I love everything to do with the historic nature of our community. I moved here from a community that didn't really respect its historic buildings. And when we first began in 2017, we began with an ordinance. And I think I can speak for myself, I wasn't quite sure what we were going to do with that ordinance. It was a big ordinance. It had a lot of instructions and a lot of words. Staff worked hard to guide us, but it wasn't until Ms. Dalton came on board and began to whip us in shape. I don't know if you're aware of Ms. Dalton's credentials, but I will tell you, and I'm qualified to evaluate her. I, too, am trained as a professional planner, although I don't have quite all the credentials she has. One of the designations she has behind her name are 4 letters called AICP. And for those of you that are familiar with planners, you have to work very, very hard and pass a lot of exams to get that designation. And because I am trained as a professional planner and have a master's degree in planning, I can tell you by the way she talks, walks, and demonstrates her knowledge about historic preservation and what we should be doing as a community about it. She knows her stuff. And she makes us work hard. She instituted having work sessions before every meeting, an hour-long work session. And then the day we had training from 4 to 5, a work session from 5 to 6, and then our meeting with about 7 or 8 agenda items started at 6, and I don't know what time we got done. But your Historic Preservation Board works very, very hard, and we're happy to do it. Now, I will tell you all right now, this is a little bit of self-politicking. My term will be up this next whenever, but I still am eligible to serve again because I didn't serve a full term the first time I was appointed. So you will see my application coming across the dais, and I hope you'll think favorably. And I hope you'll think favorably of Ms. Dalton, because she has done so much for our city. I don't know what you're paying her, but it's probably not enough. And if you look at Sanford and what that community's done, I would like us to get to where they are, and she can bring us there if we behave and follow her instructions. And it takes you guys. We're going to be sending like the design guidelines to you to review and put your tweaks on them. We need you to put the final touch on what St. Cloud is going to look like, and the citizens are going to look to you to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. You're lucky you've got that kind of cheerleader in your corner.
I don't even have to speak when she's around. It's amazing. I want to have each of the board members at least have the opportunity to come up with Chair Clark, please, and introduce themselves individually, and just whatever communication you want to convey to council would be great.
my face is not unfamiliar to you all, but I'm Richard Clark, and I serve as the chair of the board. Like Member Jones, I can tell you that Ms. Dalton is definitely a very effective consultant that you've hired, and I think that you should continue to utilize her and help her to guide us. She definitely puts us to work, as Member Jones says, but, you know, I work at this because I have a deep appreciation for the historic element here in St. Cloud, and that's why I serve.
Thank you. Can I ask when the board members come up, if you have any suggestions of what we can do to help you, move along? Because I know we're all interested in preserving the history, and I know Councilmember Askew will bring up, as he goes on his walks, how upset he is about things being torn down and, things like that. I think we're all in support of trying to move things forward. So if there's something we could do to help you, feel free to mention that too.
Hi, my name's Patrice Campbell, and I'm the newbie on the board. This is like my third meeting, so I'm really getting a lot of information. I've been here, my dad retired, and we moved here in the late 60s, and met my husband at the lakefront in 72, and married 74, and came back and bought a home on Florida Avenue, and Dave has watched us transform it the best we can, and we love it. But I do love the history of St. Cloud. I love what we have to offer. I see these other communities like Baldwin Park and Celebration and all these other communities try to mimic what we have naturally. And we just need to enhance it because it's kind of been sitting dormant for a while. And now that you have this board and Miss Dalton, we're like, racehorses ready to go. There's many buildings, and I'm like, Dave, I get frustrated. I just get so frustrated when I see homes that have such character, and they're either torn down or they are, I don't want to call them enhanced. They're like changed to the point that they've lost what they are. But so I'm thankful to be here, and I look forward to working hard and getting the city of St. Cloud more and more recognitions, and as well as getting our hotel done and anything else that we need to get done to make the city beautiful and get people in here that will just want to walk our streets and enjoy our commerce and be ready to purchase a home and love on that older home like we've all been. But thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to be on this board. I look forward to doing what I can to make St. Cloud beautiful again. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, council. Richard Estel. Some of you may recognize me as a friendly face, others maybe a thorn in your side. I'm not sure which. I appreciate the opportunity to serve on the Historic Preservation Board. I do love our historic architecture, our historic homes. I do want to serve to preserve that. As we know, there's a lot of growth going on right now, and I think that's an important part of it, is that we preserve as much of that as we can. So just wanted to say thank you for that. She has been fantastic, Ms. Dalton, in guiding us, helping to get us educational opportunities, pushing us in the right direction. So I'm also, I want to convey how important she is to what we're doing now. It really is a tremendous asset. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. My name's Elizabeth Lemug. I'm a board member as well. They pretty much have said everything I would say. I appreciate being on the board as well. It's been a learning experience. When I first started, it was before she came on, and I was completely lost. So I do definitely appreciate that she's here to help guide us. It's definitely helped immensely. That's about it. I don't really have any more to add.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see Vice Chair Jones Stark here, so I think we've got everybody covered. You asked the question about what could be done to help support the Historic Preservation Board. one of the things that I've noticed, and I've had conversations with your Deputy City Manager, Veronica Miller, as well as Ms. Melissa Dunklin, your Planning Director, is that HPB does not have a dedicated budget right now. So what's happening is all these efforts this year, for example, and what we've talked about for next year, is all coming out of Planning Department budget. Which is fine, it's great, it gets the job done, but having eventually considering, and this was also something that I had a conversation with your finance director about, considering eventually having HPB have their own budget. Give you an example, right now we have a statewide historic preservation conference coming up in July called Preservation on Main Street. It's a collaboration between the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation and Main Street, Florida Main Street program. And lucky enough, there is some money in the budget in the planning department to actually send board members to the preservation conference, which is fantastic. So we actually do have a couple of board members as well as a couple of staff who are going to be able to go to that conference because you all have money in the budget for that. But that would be an example of something where if HPB had a dedicated budget where that could be counted on year after year. Going to the conferences, especially for board members, is wonderful because they're actually able to talk to people in other communities and hear, well, just from the presentations alone, see what's happening in other communities. But those one-on-one conversations in social settings are really impactful because it's not in a formal setting. They could really ask some good questions and bring that knowledge back to the community. So it's not just me sharing it. It's now you've got other people here at the city, like your staff members and the board members. So that would be an example of one thing. All the objectives that HPB is working on that have a dollar amount to them is all coming out of the planning department budget. So if that can somehow be carved out to say that's HPB, that would probably be something that would go a long way.
Great. Thank you. I saw a few lights up here. I think Mr. Askew was first. He kind of hit it, unhit it.
This actually makes me worry more. Are you on the chopping block or something? It seems like everybody's coming up here.
They just
and-
love me. I don't know. I'm kind of overwhelmed by these.
No, I actually come to, as you see me every once in a while, I go to the historical meetings. What they're doing is fantastic, and I know you're starting them down a path of greatness, I think. So I watch what you're doing. I appreciate it. So I didn't know you were on the chopping block, but I hope you're not.
She is not. She is not.
Thank you.
Mr. Trace.
Bob Colby, I thought was next.
Oh,
I was just going to say to Mr. Askew, it's not that we feel she's on the chopping block, it's just that since the board has started, and that the first couple of years was a lot of
false starts.
lack of continuity, we'll put it this way. Christina brings a very strong feeling of continuity and direction, and that's why we want to make sure that you know that we appreciate her value to the city.
Okay, awesome.
But you got to work on getting Miss Jones behind you. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Don't make me open my mouth.
Mr. Urban.
Yeah, I would like to say I'm a huge history buff myself, and I watch a lot of the Historic Preservation Board meetings online, and I just really encouraged by the progress that it's starting to make now. And our downtown and our city has such a unique story to tell. It's really exciting to start. I know right now it's a big construction site, but I think it's going to finally start to come together and really be something special. So one thing I did want to ask is, can you explain a little more what a designation of a National Register of Historic Places, what that would mean for our downtown area?
Absolutely. So from a regulatory perspective, it does not add any kind of additional layer of regulations. The local ordinance is always going to be the highest level of regulation that you have. So really what it is it's an honorary recognition to start with that is actually going to serve to elevate how people perceive St. Cloud, and especially historic St. Cloud. Having that designation is very valuable, especially when it comes to heritage tourism. I know you don't have a formal kind of program for heritage tourism yet, but hopefully eventually that is what the work of the HPB will flow into. The grant application that we just submitted is actually for creation of a historic preservation plan and update of an ordinance. If we are lucky enough to receive that grant and we work on the historic preservation plan, a big objective of that would be heritage tourism, which, St. Cloud is prime for. Your location to the theme parks and just all the assets that you all have here, walkable community, all the development that you're ripe for right now. So that's one thing. The second thing is that with the National Register, it was actually designed to protect property owners really against impacts from the federal government. So dollars that were being spent, federal funds, to not adversely impact historic resources. So it actually gives a level of protection in some way to property owners who are contributing within the National Register District. But for development, it's extremely valuable because once you all are a National Register Historic District, the contributing income producing buildings in your town, those are the buildings that can actually get up to a 20% federal rehabilitation tax credit. So when you look at projects like the St. Cloud Hotel or any of your commercial projects or even residential, if it's not private owned, it's, you can have like a duplex or a quad or something like that, that would be eligible for the federal rehabilitation tax credit once you all have that National Register designation.
Awesome, thank you.
Could I mention something? Today, we've been talking about the history from the point of view of the physical domain. Now, I want to spend just a minute talking about St. Cloud's history from the records of about the history of our city. I volunteer 3 days a week at the Heritage Museum just down on Massachusetts Avenue. And we have, I don't know how many pages and binders full of documents that are about the people that have lived in our community and have built and made St. Cloud what it is today, but also the structures and the buildings. So when people need to research about old buildings and what they looked like in times past, we often have pictures of those, and they can be very helpful when doing research about historic structures. And you just can't imagine what we have. I can, because I've touched most of them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Trace.
Thank you. I think it's great what the Historic Preservation Board has done over the past couple of years that I've seen it kind of come into its own. A couple questions, probably for Mr. Sturgeon. The letter of support, are you fine with the head nod now, or do we need to specifically bring that back for those grant applications?
No, I'm good with that. Just
Okay.
consensus
Think we're
would
all
be good.
Okay. And then the May meeting as well, I think it's a great idea, and then the January update, I think all that's fantastic. On the awards event, I think you said Paula is on your guys' board, is on the Historic Preservation Board, Paul
She is.
Stark. So I didn't know if Main Street would be able to join in with that, maybe give out those awards. I know they're doing their annual meeting too, so I don't know if that'll be under that historic bucket of Main Street.
Many communities do either partner if there's a local historic preservation group or with the Main Street. So that's actually a very common thing.
Yeah, she does a great event, annual meeting every year, and they give out some awards, so.
Is it this month?
Oh,
I just saw an invitation.
okay.
Maybe this month.
And to stop the bleeding on some of these houses are getting torn down, is it possible for us to put together an incentive program? Like if someone wants to tear down or it's dilapidated or whatever, we can move those to a site that the city owns just to save some of those structures? Like, do we have budget numbers of what one of these, 1,000-square-foot kit houses might cost to relocate if it's in the grid, and we can move it to a different property to where we can just quickly say, all right, within 30 days, we can fund that, move it somewhere?
So you mentioned this at the May meeting, and I didn't forget. So I actually did follow up with the state, because my concern was usually preservation, you don't want to relocate buildings proactively. It's not good preservation practice. So I talked to the representative from the State Historic Preservation Office when they were here last week, as we were doing our drive-by, and I showed him some of the properties of concern. If it's listed as contributing to the National Register District and it gets relocated within the National Register District, they will still consider it contributing.
Okay.
So that's a good sign for potential relocation. We've also had discussions internally with staff about how we can look at the zoning, the CBD1, the CBD2 zoning, and figure out where these properties could potentially go that would actually, serve two purposes, which is freeing up the lot for development, for the higher intensity development that you all want to see, but also saving the house in a location that makes sense. And so I know that we're going to be having ongoing conversations about that. We just kind of started talking about that last month. But that's definitely something that you recommended, and that is something that we're discussing.
Yeah, because if there's vacant city-owned property that we don't really have a use for, we might be able to move it to some of those and figure out something to do with it.
There's typically also not a standard rate for relocation, because the things that you have to consider with relocation is where the building is coming from and where it's going to, and all the obstacles along the way. So if you've got power lines, tree canopy, things like that, that makes moves a lot more problematic.
That's what's nice about the grid, is we can just kind of, Tetris it all the way around the.
Well, I always joke around when I look at old Sanborn maps, historic Sanborn maps, 1890s, 1900s, houses used to move around like chess pieces. It was not uncommon for these smaller wood frame houses to move. It's just that we have so many things that limit us nowadays with the power lines, the tree canopy, all of that they didn't have 100 years ago. So it's possible, but sometimes it's costlier. You could be going another 2 blocks, but the obstacles in that way make it way more expensive. So it's hard to come up with one price. I think what we need to do, as I discussed last time, is look at all your properties that are from the founding of St. Cloud, those 1909 to about 1916, 1917 properties, and kind of look at those first and say, okay, how do we want to protect these? And some of those are outside the district. So that's another thing. Do we want to move houses from outside the district into the district? So there's a lot of conversations that need to be had around that, but it would be a good idea to be proactive about some of this.
And just figure out what some of the stuff costs, and then just try to put some funds towards that.
Yeah.
And then also some of our CRA grants, is it possible to have like a historic check mark in there, and maybe we can modify some of, or adjust some of the funding caps and some of that if they're doing it on a historic structure versus just something in the CRA? Not something to be answered today, but just an idea to throw out of.
This is a conversation I've had
funds.
with Antoinette and with Deirdre about when they're applying for a CRA grant, that they should get HPB approval before they even submit the application to CRA. So that's something that's not in place right now as far as a requirement to have that approval ahead of time. That's something that we have discussed. We don't have a final determination on that yet, but that's going to be, and hopefully something that does get implemented, because many communities that have CRAs in the historic district, you have to get the historic preservation approval first.
Well, my worry with some of that is I think it already takes a bit too long for some of these CRA grants to happen, that folks just aren't waiting around for it. So if we add another layer, so as long as we can figure out a way to accelerate it and get everything situated that way. And then commercial buildings. I look at old postcards, or I buy a bunch of old postcards online of some of these buildings, and it's like, I can't even picture where that is downtown, because it was just changed so much since then. It seems like there's only 2 or 3 buildings that still look like what they did back 100 years ago. So having some sort of incentives or something for those commercial buildings, or at least giving some of those property owners the idea of, okay, it doesn't have to look like the thing that was cool in the 70s or 80s. We can make it look back, like it was in the teens and 20s.
That's one of the great things about the federal rehabilitation tax credit, where if they do pursue something like that, if they're doing extra work, they would have to come back more in alignment of what that appearance of the building is. That's the thing that you have a lot in St. Cloud, is you've got a lot of buildings where over the years they've been clad in aluminum or vinyl siding, their original windows have been torn out. So when you look at it initially, it's like, what's really historic about this? But if you start peeling back what actually got placed on the building, I see it time and time again where aluminum siding or vinyl siding is removed and you've got this amazing shingle work or trim work or something like that underneath. And I keep saying it and I'll just continue to say it. I think that St. Cloud needs 4 award-winning rehabs in the district where people really start sitting up and taking notice and really want to actually take that approach and bring the buildings back to a more original appearance. Because when you look at people investing and all of that, they want the authenticity more than anything.
Definitely.
So,
Thank you.
Do you want to go before Mr. Askew?
No,
or-
Mr. Askew?
Mr. Askew.
So you're bringing up all these points, and it seems like all of the historical buildings that I see are being changed are not in the CRA. Are we looking at some plan of changing the CRA so it maybe encompasses a little more of the grid where most of our historical homes are?
I haven't been involved in any of those conversations, so I'm not sure. Would Josh know? No, not sure. So that'd be something I'd have to revisit with you all.
I'd have to go to
Okay, well, that would be, the CRA would be talking about that, but I would assume it would be walking with you through it, and, because there's a process to that as well, so.
I think changing the CRA was going to be challenging based on our conversations we're having with the
Right.
county because they
Right.
have to approve the
Yep.
new limits, but I think it's a great idea.
That's been one of my concerns, because I live on Florida and Fourth. Our home's like 95 years old, and we have homes around us that have taken liberties to do things to their homes, and there's no protection. There's nothing. And, and you go over to Ohio, you go over to Pennsylvania and New York, all these different locations, and you have these homes that are 90-plus years old, and we're out of the grid. So there's nothing that they're restricted from doing. So that's one thing that, being on the Historic Preservation Board, I would love to see that grid. Even if I don't know if we could pick and choose just some of the homes that have historic meaning to them, to protect them, so that somebody doesn't come in and go, I'm going to make this better, but you're not. You're updating it, and it's not meant to be updated that far. So anyways, that's been one of my big issues, because I see these homes, and I'm like, what are you doing? And there's nothing to stop them, so.
Is it, Deputy Mayor, would the county, I would assume, be more palatable for residential homes than commercial homes? Because commercial, I would assume, brings in more tax dollars and things like that, but.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, you don't necessarily need the CRA, right? You just would expand the historic preservation.
Exactly, you're talking about two different areas
Yeah,
right
you
now.
just expand the historic preservation and not.
You certainly have authority to expand the
CRA.
historic preservation area.
So the grant that Main Street is pursuing right now, that they have the application for, that is to survey and inventory areas outside of the existing districts to see what future historic districts could be made.
There you go.
But this is something where when we bring back the potential tax exemption to you all, when that actually gets created, and if you all adopt it, that could be something where that tax exemption could be available to people outside the historic district if their building has been evaluated and determined to be contributing to a potential historic district. That would encourage, through the tax exemption, for rehabs to be done sensitively, because that would be laid out in the application for the exemption. So there's some different ways that you can achieve this, and I think bringing that to you all and having that exemption done and in place before the end of 2022 is going to be something that will benefit you all.
Right, that's kind of like dangling the carrot to try to get them to do the job.
Yeah.
So, awesome.
Great. City Manager?
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just want to clarify, so the conference, you do have funding for that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
we
can help
do.
you out if you don't. so.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. It's
Thank
my understanding.
I just wanted to make sure.
Because Melissa reached out to me and asked to find out who can go. And so I know that that's already been resolved, but
Very
she
good.
did have.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Urban?
Sorry, one more question. You mentioned that it would help to, in the future, have a dedicated budget for the Historic Preservation Board. Is that something that
Well-
that we could work towards, or?
We have an upcoming budget workshop, and absolutely, the council can give direction on that, and we can move some money around. Absolutely.
Can we give it direction right now?
I'd rather have it during the budget presentation. We just balance, but like I said, there's some flexibility in the budget to do that. That's okay. So,
Okay.
I'll put it on the agenda for then.
Awesome, thanks.
I had that on my list, so you saved me one. But I also want to thank everyone for coming and the board for coming. I served on the Historic Society Board for 6 years, so I love all the stuff. And I was going to suggest, which I'm sure you probably have, was about the kit houses. Has anybody reached out to Anza Bast about that? Because she has tons of records.
I don't know who that is. I know that,
I know who she is.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, Anza Bast always answers historic questions. Anytime anybody answers, shows up with a photo and the
I will check with Olive Forney, who's also on our
Yeah.
board, and see if she has reached out to Anza. And if not,
it's worth a
perhaps
shot.
one of us could. I know who Anza is.
And with regard to the grant, I know you were mentioning the $50,000 grant, but does she need anything or do they need anything from the council? That's within your authority, right? So that's something that could come to the city manager but doesn't have to come back to council, or?
The grant process, we have to have approval to apply for a grant from the council before we do. Now, we've run up.
But I thought it was with an authority, and like she's saying
Well, I think we mentioned
50,000.
these were non-matching grants.
this did already go to council.
Okay.
So the
Yeah.
approval to pursue the grant, that's already been done. Now, if we're lucky enough to receive the grant, that will also come back to you all to accept the grant.
Okay, great. Along the lines of what Mr. Trace was saying, I think it was Mr. Trace was saying about moving houses and things like that. I was recently at the Redneck Gala, and one of the items that was being auctioned off was all this 1915 tin from a ceiling of a building downtown. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I was calling people like, don't you need this for your, I was trying to get somebody to bid it because, I mean, I don't need tin, but I was trying to get somebody to buy it. But I mean, even if you weren't moving buildings, is there some desire, or should we be doing something where if somebody was going to go, hey, I'm going to pull down this tin, I'm not using it, we would salvage it for another project? Is that something we should be looking into? Even materials, like if they were pulling down, ripping up flooring or something that was historic?
I did actually have a conversation with your deputy city manager and your city attorney about this, the potential of the city connecting property owners who might, for salvage, architectural salvage. And so, how could this potentially be done where not having the city in any kind of liability, situation? So I don't think we ever resolved that, but we kind of talked about how if the city can bring people together and just share the contact information,
Yeah.
that we can develop something like that. But I know that there was a little bit of concern about liability.
Okay,
So-
that makes sense. But I just, saw the resource and I was like, oh my gosh, I've heard a lot of people, lamenting about the fact that some tin came down in another building in downtown. And so anyways, it just caught my attention about salvaging it. And one of the big concerns I always have is like, how do people know? Somebody comes into town, they move here from Texas, they go buy a house and they're in the historic preservation district, but they don't know. Like, that's always the kind of thing to me is like finding a way to let people know what the rules are. And then I feel like a lot of people, maybe on purpose or, uneducated, they'll make a decision and tear something down. And then we're like, hey, you can't do that. You have to have a permit, but it's too late. It's already down. It's already ruined, so that's always kind of a struggle on like how to make sure everybody knows about it.
So there's a couple of things. One is when we do update the ordinance, and I've actually been working with staff, Abe Fogel. He's fantastic, by the way. When everybody's talking about don't get rid of me for whatever reason, don't get rid of him. I love him. He and Stephanie Streeter have been fantastic. But now I just lost my train of thought. But the ordinance update, he's been helping me to track what things that we want to include in the ordinance update. There's a couple of things going on here, one of which, because you all have not been doing historic preservation that long, there's some coordination that really needs to happen with building department and historic preservation. There is an opportunity for the building official to utilize the existing building code and not apply new building code standards to properties in the district. So with the example of the tin ceiling, that came out of a building. I wasn't here at the time, but my understanding was it was building code related issue that it had to be taken out. Sometimes there are alternatives that could be explored within that existing building code. So there's some more things that need to happen internally, and one of it's just kind of getting up to speed with the things that can happen in historic districts legally where the city is still protected. So again, with that 10, that was something where that was a call that the building official had to make because of looking at that section of code. The other thing that we have that's definitely going into an ordinance update, definitely, is to strengthen any language regarding demolition by neglect. So demolition by neglect is a strategy by property owners to come in and do damage to a historic building, so then they could later come to the city and say, our building is so compromised, like we had a structural engineer come in and now we have to demolish it. So that's something in the ordinance update that we're probably gonna have multi-pages dedicated to demolition by neglect to make sure that that doesn't happen. Having said that, internally, there also needs to be a process that has to be followed if you want that to be effective. So as an example, if you suspect that a building is being demolished by neglect, you would have code enforcement actually cite that building under demolition by neglect. So not just lack of maintenance or what they would normally cite, but specifically in the preservation ordinance. That gives an opportunity at such time that the property owner comes in and asks for that demolition, you can point to that section of code and not grant them the demolition. So a lot of property owners will say, you know, what have you done? Where are your building permits? We cited you for demolition by neglect 2 years ago, and you haven't applied for a single building permit to cure any of these problems that are on the property. Now you're asking us for a demolition. We're not going to do it. And that way, if the property owner decides to go sue the city, you have that legal, you know, paperwork and that record where it's been cited specifically for this. So you're basically putting the property owner on notice that you're not going to grant them a demolition when the ask comes. So that is something that, you know, for the ordinance update, we're really looking at. And all these little things are important to think of for when we get into the ordinance, because that's a lot of the stuff is stuff that we can codify. Where you all are right now is actually a great place to be. You have a starter ordinance, you have a board that's in training, and now you can strengthen that ordinance. People are comfortable with the fact that you have historic districts. I always tell communities, don't take somebody's ordinance that's, you know, Sanford, for example, they've had historic preservation ordinances for close to 30 years. A new city taking on historic preservation does not want to take somebody else's ordinance and try to use that. It would fail miserably because it's too much of a shock for your citizens, for your property owners. So where you are right now is actually exactly where you should be. It's a very good place to be. And a lot of these things, hopefully, when we do the ordinance update, which should be sometime in 2023, a lot of these things will get ironed out and resolved.
Okay, I have one last question for you. You've mentioned it a couple times when we've seen you, you know, we just need like 4 award-winning rehabs. Is there strategies to try to get someone to come and want to rehab a building, or, you know, is there things that we could be doing, or partnerships, or?
Yeah, if there's any properties that are potential opportunity properties that the CRA could maybe get involved in, I'm gonna pick on Sanford and use Sanford as an example again. In Sanford, there was a building that was the old jail building, and from the front of the building, you couldn't tell. It was covered in stucco. It was, you know, had gotten incorporated in part of the dry cleaners. I knew that there was a historic building behind there because I had the historic photos, as you've talked about, the old postcards and things like that. So we actually got the CRA to fund, the city foreclosed on the building because of taxes and liens and all of that. And once the city took it over, the CRA put funds to actually restore the facade. So that stucco was peeled back, the original jail bars were shown, the original windows, the original doors, the brick, it had been stuccoed over, that stucco was removed, so the brick was restored, and that gave the building its, you know, authentic original appearance. Then they were able to work with a developer who bought the building and has since turned it into a restaurant called the Jailhouse Restaurant. That wound up getting a statewide historic preservation award and is basically the most popular restaurant, aside from the Willow Tree, in Sanford that there is. So something like that, and that building, I don't know if you all have been to Sanford and know the jailhouse building that I'm talking about. It's a small building. It's, really, it's a small commercial building, but it was so impactful where it's located in the downtown and what it became. And for heritage tourism, people love saying that they had a meal behind bars. So something like that, if you can identify a couple of key buildings, or if you've got property owners that you could work with on the CRA grants, kind of hand-holding through that design process. I know we're not supposed to design projects for people, but if we had a couple of key buildings that we could kind of make suggestions on, I think that's what you need. But above all, St. Cloud Hotel's got to get done. That building has got to get done. If you all want to create any kind of industry of heritage tourism in town, you have to capture people with the overnight stays. So anything that can happen to get that project, moving. And I know there's a lot of opinions from people who don't know the ins and outs of what's happened with that project. I can tell you, I've walked every floor of that project. I've climbed the ladders internally. The work that has been done in that building is very, very good work. So while people don't see the progress that's happening, just the framing, I have never seen such straight framing in my life, and just that the considerations that have gone into the planning of the spaces. So that, I know the city doesn't own that property, but that's going to be a critical one. So that would be an example of one where if it can get done and it can get done well, that's going to be a game changer.
Well, do you have any more questions or comments? Well, great. I think this was wonderful. I like
Thank
this. I mean, to share ideas and hear what everybody's working on. I'm all for doing this at whatever interval, is the most helpful. So
Thank you all for your time.
with that,
Thank
we'll
you. Good to hear you're not on the chopping block.
Can I go have a cocktail now?
Yes. We'll adjourn the workshop. So we need probably a few minutes to get set up for the.
Sure.